You might have noticed if you spent enough time playing different Persona games, their anime, their spin-offs, and more, that Atlus takes a fairly lackadaisical approach to the canon in their broader games. Other than a few tying lines, very little between the SMT games in terms of world lore stays consistent, even more so with countless spin-off franchises. Persona, of course, being one of them. That being said, canon has actually been really well preserved from Persona 3 to 5. Despite the games seemingly choosing to portray the metaverse and world of the public subconscious in different ways, there's always been an explanation, making the Hashino Persona games some of the most solid for establishing a consistent across games world of Persona lore. Well, and then there's the spin-offs. Before I get into canon, what is canon, to what extent and what I mean by canon, let me explain, for the purposes of this Persona 4 analysis project, why, for me, canon matters. In a word, having a grasp on canon allows perception. It gives someone a clear lens to understand anything that is going on in the world of Persona 4 as if it were a real place. For Persona, with its robust characters and themes, this coherent vision is required if someone wants to engage with the art honestly as a world separate from themselves. This doesn't mean that people can't take these characters and have fun things to do with them, or that fanon doesn't have its own place, because things like that will necessarily form whenever people love different types of medias. The different perspectives and experiences put onto these characters will cause them to be wanted or seen in different ways than from their original portrayal. It's the means of showing fan passion. They aren't in competition, in other words. Fanon and canon are both real, they're both valid, but they occupy completely different meanings and spaces. Canon is about trying to understand the art that you love and the artist who made it, engaging with the thing that you enjoy with curiosity and a desire to learn. It's like if you thought someone that you worked with seemed cool and you wanted to be friends with them. But instead of going up to meet them, you track down and ask someone they went to elementary school with what they were like. If you're curious of who they are, it's best to go to the source and ask them themselves. Persona canon isn't as easy as fan works and published works, though. Persona 4 notoriously has been milked for all it's worth, with a dancing game, 2 fighting games, multiple light novels and manga, some of which still remain untranslated, 2 anime series, and even 2 versions of the same original game. Let's start with who made them. Persona 4 was written by Yuichiro Tanaka, Katsuda Hashino, and Akira Kawasaki, with Hashino doubling as the game's director. To give a reference point, the duo of Yuichiro Tanaka and Hashino have been consistent writing leads for the Persona series, starting in Persona 3 and leading still through Persona 5, with Tanaka focusing mostly on the writing above all else, and Hashino leaning more into the structure and general directing of the entire series. Tanaka, Hashino, and Akira Kawasaki were also the same writers for the Golden re-release, meaning the exact same staff and creative minds penned it. So, someone may think, what? How can those both be canon? It's the same story, but there's clearly contradictory events. Why are they separate? As for the plot of Golden, Marie aimed to be forgotten, to go into the fog and take the threat of that world with her. In other words, the canon explanation is merely that you are reflecting on a version of your journey where you never befriended Marie, and you forgot about her. So some slight inconsistencies are explained. Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden is merely the existence of one route and an explanation for why that route isn't in the original. It creates an explanation where you could easily see how they take place in the same theoretical timeline and keep their canon consistency. There are 2 main metrics that canon would be determined by. 1, is it made by the people who made the original property? And 2, does it contradict previous information? I don't mean interpretation either, but raw events, timelines, character reactions, etc. You either had coffee at 10 a.m. this morning, or you didn't have coffee. You didn't kind of have coffee, you either ingested it or you didn't. It's those types of contradictions I'm talking about. Things that are stable events that cannot possibly contradictorily exist at once. So first, here's the list of notable Persona 4 spin-offs I felt like compiling. These are all in some way licensed officially by Atlus or Sega. These are all technically official projects. Now, these are the projects that contain no consistent writing staff, but at least feature the series director Hashino in a producer role, meaning he may have helped supervise when things went ridiculously out of line, like the rumored scrapping of Nanako and Dojima as dual fighters in Persona 4 Arena. But other than Hashino's involvement as producer, these operated almost entirely separate from the main Atlus team. Arena and Ultimax also featured both Akira Kawasaki and Tanaka in lighter writing roles, writing sub-scenarios alongside a greater team in Arena, and Tanaka moving from a writing role to a supervisor role in Ultimax. Now, as you may expect, these are the projects that contain no involvement from the people who made Persona 4. And these are the projects with no writing involvement. None of the original writers are credited, and many were worked on almost entirely independent of Atlus's involvement. Consider these like licensed-out projects using an IP, like when Crypt of the Necrodancer had a Legend of Zelda skin release on the Switch version, or when Soul Calibur on GameCube included Link as a special platform exclusive. These are the Super Mario Bros. Movie of Persona canon by involvement of the actual creators. So, from an artist and staff perspective, the only canon is Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden. But that seems a little too short, doesn't it? You probably want a little more nuance than that. Well, some of the staffing does get more interesting. While not changing much, one of the directors of Arena and Ultimax is also the sole director of dancing, that is, Kazuhisa Wada. The main writer of Arena and Ultimax, Teppei Kobayashi, also was a writer on Persona 4 Dancing. Unfortunately, despite these somewhat tangential links, the crossover completely cuts off by the time that we reach Q2. Even every manga adaptation and light novel were done by different unrelated people for the art and story every time. With some crossover staff between the two anime adaptations, although none of those people worked directly with the main Persona staff on the project from staff listings. So, if you were to be incredibly generous, this is the sort of Persona 4 canon tier list ranked by creator involvement, from most to least canon. The first thing considered widely not canon by the Persona community was the light novel Tante Naoto, which depicted her duties as she was older with long hair. This interpretation of Naoto came out earlier than most spin-offs, but due to people generally giving more preference to video games over manga and light novels for canon, for no real good reason, her depiction in Dancing and Arena was seen as a blatant contradiction to the light novel. And since one was more popular and more plentiful, it was generally put aside as the quote-unquote canon. Now, none of these are technically canon, of course, as you've seen from writing staff, but while the context for the community putting Tante Naoto as non-canon is not exactly valid, the reasoning is something fairly sensible in proper context. People generally agree that two contradictory things cannot be given the same variables and context. This is literally the most certain thing in human knowledge if you haven't already studied it in a Philosophy 101 class. It's Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, and it's certain because not only is it an impossibility within reality not to be true, but it also cannot function even as an abstract concept. It's the single truth all science and logic is based on. Every time you even disagree with someone, you are asserting your opinion to be separate from another's. And so even by arguing against the principle of non-contradiction itself is proof of its law's truthfulness. That's how fundamentally truism-y this statement is. So let's apply that to goofy anime characters. Yukiko cannot both leave the inn to start her life and at the same time spend her life at the inn taking care of it. Shu cannot both cheat on his major exam and not do so at all, assuming the same date, same exam, and all other variables being consistent. This is how we would establish if something is canon without creator context. When works not made by the original creators are made, errors slip through, likely without their knowledge, because there's so much nuance involved in these grander stories. These create a contradiction to the original materials of the world, making the event in some spin-offs into impossibilities. If we were to go into one of these spin-offs then and derive extra character details from them, from something that also contains logically impossible depictions of events and characters, it causes their consideration into canon to be pretty much untenable. Now, some may consider it to be sort of loose or semi-canon, and I can understand this interpretation in some ways. Like, what we are seeing is actually just a loose retelling, or like a general result of a game of telephone where the fine details are distorted while keeping the general message true. This means fine character details and actions still can't be taken into regard when you try to analyze the character's actions from the original property, but theoretically they could have happened in a sort of vague sense, as Persona 4 is all about seeing through the lies and through the fog and illusions and separations and contradictions to see through the truth. I find it fitting that these inconsistencies exist, and can see someone maybe seeing the major Flanderizations and incorrect lore details to be a result of this broader theme. This is mainly due to Persona spin-offs primarily focusing on taking notable events from the games that fans showed that they liked, and hamming up on the fan service elements to 100. In a normal playthrough, you may only get one chance to do something, but in the spin-offs, one-off trait moments become entire character traits and personality aspects. Take the Flanderization of Akihiko from Persona 3 into some protein junkie in the Q games, and even a bit in P3 dancing. Take Yukiko's rare moments of sadism and basically turn it up until she's Nico Robin at some point in the anime. Take Yosuke's arc to appreciate and love Inaba as a town that made him realize he is special, and revert him back to crap talking about how Inaba sucks in Persona 4 dancing. Events in spin-offs that supposedly take place after the events of Persona 4 depict them with starting personas, for example, sometimes explained and rationalized, sometimes never addressed, despite being at the point of completion for their character arcs. Take a character whose place in the story and lore-wise is linked to the fact that they don't have a shadow, and then give them one anyways, because that would be cool, right? But while it might be cool, and it's perfectly fine to love it, taking it into characterization for canon projects creates an infinitely tangled web and seedbed of unsound bias. The team of Persona 4 realized they wanted to play up all the romance stuff and U for romance fan service, so they changed his actions, going from a range of embarrassment to shame to being tired or cringing at people, and turning him into active involvement, unbuttoning his shirt and going crazy too. Completely mix and mismash character moments like with Ai, Cole, and Daisuke, and change pretty much everything about them in order to fit this new fan service focused outline of the story, shelving Daisuke almost entirely, butchering Cole's primary character arc, just so Ai can have a little more flirty scenes with you. The Golden animation mainly focuses on the new cutscenes added in Persona 4 Golden, and then just sort of plops Marie in with no real explanation. Once again, it's not even to say that these are subpar or bad, but that they are bastardizations of the source material that can hardly identify anything certainly from them that isn't just cut and paste directly. That's why, for my analysis of Persona 4, I only take into account the events of the game itself, both Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden, because that is the only piece of media created with the creator's full vision. But it also is the most fair way to pin down who a character is or how they act within the story. If you would personally like to consider different things that are extra textual to the games as well, that's your own prerogative. That's perfectly fine. But my number one goal is to understand the characters, themes, plots, and world of Persona 4 depicted, and relay that information to you. I know this is a broad topic, but I hope I explained my reasoning for why I am only contending with the game itself in all my analysis. I may feature sprites from the fighting games or shots from the different anime, but I ultimately found it to be a logically impossible task of organizing the countless contradictions and addendums by people who didn't even work on Persona 4. This did take a lot of research, so I'd appreciate your like and comment. Once again, not canon does not mean not valid. It's not less enjoyable or less good necessarily because it isn't canon. It just means that you can't extrapolate certain analysis about said characters from it. That's all. See you next week. Support my Patreon. I'm barely able to pay rent this month.